just cover everything that was on your list in general. Oh, everything good? Okay. A little bit about me. As you know, I got my PhD at Texas Tech University. I got involved in the field of mammalogy as an undergraduate, and I have about 12 years experience working in the field, collecting mammals, and prepping them for museum specimens. I've also done work internationally in Guatemala and El Salvador. And so I've been very lucky to see parts of both the US and Central America that a lot of people don't get to see, and a lot of animals in the wild that a lot of people, also don't get to experience. So it's been a lot of fun, something completely different from what my parents expected me to do. I shocked my mother, but it's definitely been something that I love to do, and I continue to do it at South Plains College with the wildlife class that we teach there. So just very quickly, characteristics of mammals include hair. Our hair is made up primarily of keratin, which is the same material that's found in feathers and the scales on reptiles. And hair, of course, is an insulating layer. It has a lot of benefits for our bodies. All mammals have mammary glands, so they're able to nourish their young. And our teeth are specialized. So we have 4 different types of teeth, whereas things like reptiles have 1 type of tooth, so all their teeth look exactly the same. And the specialization has allowed mammals to be able to process different types of food. And so there's quite a bit of diversity when you look at the diets of mammals. This is the only group that has developed sweat glands as well as sebaceous and scent glands. And scent glands are used commonly for males to mark territories. Scent glands are oftentimes located around the anus, sometimes on the mouth, or sorry, on the face or on the legs, so that as they walk through grass and rub up against trees, they can spread their scent and other males know that they're there. And of course, we're all familiar with skunks and their scent glands used for defense. And finally, this is the only group that has developed structures like horns and antlers. And typically, it's the male that has these structures, but not always. And we'll talk about some of those specific examples a little bit later on. But looking at how mammals are classified, there are 3 groups of mammals. The first one contains the egg-laying mammals. So these are going to be the duckbill platypus as well as the echidna, and these organisms are found only in Australia and New Guinea. Then we have the marsupial mammals. They're going to have a pouch that they house their young in that's going to allow for them to further develop, because when they're born very early on, very underdeveloped, and they have to crawl to that pouch and latch onto a nipple and finish developing there. This has been beneficial for some of these marsupials because, like our kangaroo here, she has a joey in the pouch, and he's fairly large. He's old enough to where he can get out on his own and graze with her, but she probably has another one in her pouch latched to a nipple that's currently developing, and then she can also be pregnant. And so she can have 3 generations, latched onto her at one time, which definitely increases their ability to reproduce rapidly. Most mammals are going to be placental mammals, and so they're going to have a longer gestation period, and they are going to have a placenta that forms that intimate relationship between mother and offspring, so that there's exchange between the two, exchange of waste, nutrients, blood, oxygen, everything that embryo is going to need. And so they're going to be born at a more developed stage than the marsupial mammals are. So looking at the orders of mammals that we have in Texas, there are 10 that are native and 1 that is introduced. And we're going to start with the order that contains the Virginia opossum. This is our only marsupial mammal in the United States. When we look at their behavior, they're typically nocturnal. They like to live solitary lives, and they have some interesting defensive behaviors. We're all familiar with one. We're all familiar with playing possum. They will play dead, and that's typically a final resort if a predator or something else won't leave them alone. But they'll also hiss, show their teeth. They'll actually belch. and they will urinate and defecate and just try to make themselves seem just completely unpleasant so that that organism will leave them alone. They are resistant to snake venom. So in addition to consuming things like amphibians, small mammals, insects, they also eat both venomous and non-venomous snakes. And they have one of the lowest body temperatures of any mammal. And because of this, what's interesting is they are less susceptible to rabies. And so their body temperature is so low that the virus can't replicate. And so you typically will not find an opossum that has full-blown rabies because of their low body temperature. They are great for the environment. They are scavengers, and so they will consume things that have already died and help to, get rid of that dead matter, help with decomposition, and then of course their waste materials return those nutrients to the soil, which is beneficial for the plants in that area. They eat ticks and other ectoparasites, so that's definitely going to help control those populations of parasites. And they will deter pests in urban areas. So if they're living within neighborhoods, they'll prevent rodents and snakes from accumulating in larger numbers in those neighborhoods, which most people definitely like. I'd rather have a possum than rats or snakes personally around my house. But we have our own celebrity possum in Lubbock right now. Some of you may have seen this. She is currently at the rehabilitation center, and she is an opossum that has alopecia, and so her hair doesn't fully grow in, and she would not survive the upcoming winter months without her fur. And so luckily somebody found her and they're taking care of her. She has made national news and people are sending her sweaters to keep her warm. So I imagine she will probably become one of their ambassadors, and yeah, she's definitely making a splash, definitely our own little celebrity right now. The next order contains the manatees. These are pretty uncommon in the Gulf of Mexico, but every once in a while we'll get one that shows up. They are the only marine mammals that will feed exclusively on plants, and they can live in both saltwater and freshwater, which is pretty impressive. Most aquatic organisms can't do that. So this means that they have modifications to their kidneys and other organs that allow them to transition back and forth between those two types of water and still maintain balance within their bodies. And their role is they act as a grazer. So they're going to consume aquatic plants, especially those that have a tendency to accumulate around the coast and the shallow regions. And by grazing on those plants, they're going to prevent overgrowth. Because anytime those aquatic plants become overgrown, it's going to be harder for other organisms to survive there. And so they're keeping them from, kind of eating back and preventing overgrowth so that other organisms can thrive in that area. So it really helps with maintaining diversity in the regions that it's going to live in. Looking at our state mascot, in the order Cingulata, we have the 9-banded armadillo. They'll be active during different parts of the day depending on the time of year. So whenever it's spring and summer and it's warm, they like to be active in the morning, in the evening, at night. But when it starts getting cold, they're typically out in the middle of the day. And my advisor actually saw one out in about 5 inches of snow at his ranch, scavenging for food. So they'll even get out in the snow. A lot of people don't know this, but armadillos can swim. And so they have the ability to actually inflate their bodies. They're not sure how that happens, but they take in air and makes them more buoyant and they can swim. But if the body of water is pretty narrow, they'll actually just completely submerge themselves and walk across the bottom of that body of water to the other side. Their defensive behaviors include, if you grab them by the tail, they will start whipping around as hard as they can to try to get you to let go. They also like to try to sling their waste products on you to get away. And so definitely be careful if you ever handle an armadillo. They are known to carry leprosy, and it is the type of leprosy that can be transmitted to humans. And so for that reason, typically it's suggested that you just don't handle them. But this organism is the only mammal in Texas that has that bony carapace, so the covering on the body that's going to help protect it. And you can even see that it comes down on top of the skull. and they come through and they cut it away, but their spine is actually fused to that bony covering. These are extremely beneficial in their environments because they help to control pests, especially things like fire ants and other unpleasant insects that we typically don't want to have around. They can also be used as bioindicators. And so anytime contaminants are accumulating in any given environment, the living organisms that are there can be good indicators of how much exposure they're getting to those chemicals. And armadillos are ideal because they spend a lot of time digging in the ground. They're eating insects that are crawling along the ground, and they're highly abundant. And so they've been used for a few studies to try to understand how different chemicals are affecting different environments. And then they're considered bioengineers because they mix the soil as they dig, and they are going to create these large burrows that can be used by other organisms once they're abandoned. This one I included. It is not a native order, but we have a feral population of Japanese macaques in Texas. And I don't know how many people know this, but what happened was they were brought into Texas initially to try to conserve the species. And then once that population started rebounding, they moved into a research facility and their funding fell through. And so it fell into disrepair and the monkeys escaped. And so we have 5 counties in South Texas that have Japanese macaques just, wandering around. So from Kerr County all the way down to LaSalle County. And so I have not had the chance to actually see them with my own eyes, but try to look for them every time we go into that area. The order Lagomorpha contains the hares and the rabbits. One of the interesting behaviors that they have is they participate in coprophaging. And this is a situation where they actually consume their own feces. And the reason that they do this is because the first time they digest their food, they don't get all the nutrients from it. They don't fully digest it. So they'll consume that waste product, digest it a second time, and then they get all of the nutrients and everything from that food that they were eating. They're most active at twilight and at night, and their ecological role is also a grazer. So they're going to have teeth that are going to clip the vegetation, and they are going to have these tiny little peg teeth behind it, but they've got teeth that are designed for clipping that vegetation and grinding it, and they're going to help prevent overgrowth in those areas. We have 3 that are common in this area. The black-tailed jackrabbit is the largest, and it is well adapted to drier habitats like desert scrubland. We can look at them and we see some of these adaptations like the large ears. So these ears have a lot of blood flow, and they're going to actually help dissipate heat. So it helps the jackrabbit control its body temperature even when conditions are very hot outside. And then our cottontails, there are 2 types, the desert cottontail and the eastern cottontail. Those that we see in town around our houses, they are the eastern cottontail. The desert cottontail looks very, very similar, but its ears are larger. And they're going to be found in areas that tend to have soil that's a little more sandy. Shrews and moles are also going to be found in Texas. Moles are going to be subterranean, so they're going to spend most of their time below the surface of the ground. As they dig, this one is the eastern mole. It's common in Texas, and its large feet allow it to scoop the dirt out to the side. It almost looks like it's swimming as it scoops it away like a little shovel, and they're going to push the dirt up as they go. So you can actually see them moving just below that top surface of soil, and they'll just push those little, or push the dirt up, and they create these little tunnels. And if you ever see one that's active, you can quite literally just dust it off and grab it. They're that close to the surface. For the moles, their sense of touch and smell are highly developed since they spend most of their time underground. Their eyes over time have become reduced, and some species of moles don't even have external eye openings. So they're relying primarily on smell and touch to find the insects that they eat. Interesting fact about shrews is that they have the highest metabolism of all mammals. If they miss one meal, they can potentially die. They're really hard to keep alive in captivity because of this. And so because of this metabolism, they spend most of their day and night looking for food. And they'll probably stash some food, but they're typically active hunters. And they do something similar to what hummingbirds do. They go into a state whenever they sleep that lowers their metabolism and other bodily functions to conserve their energy. So it's like a little mini hibernation. And this allows them to survive until they can go out and get their next meal. We do have one venomous shrew here in Texas. It is not found in the High Plains region, but it has venom glands associated with its salivary glands. So as it chews on its prey, that venom will help subdue it. The two that are found in this area are going to be the least shrew and the desert shrew. Both of these species are going to burrow into the ground. So they also contribute to mixing the soil, mixing the sediments, and helping to recycle those inorganic materials that are found in the dirt. And these guys are tiny. They're about 80 millimeters in length, so a little over 3 inches from nose to tail. Bats are the second most diverse group of mammals. The largest diversity that we have in Texas is going to be in the Big Bend region. And so these are the only mammals that are capable of powered flight. And in this area, most of them are going to migrate or hibernate during the winter. We do get quite a few migratory species that come in. They're not necessarily resident species, but they will migrate through. They roost in caves, trees, rock crevices, any type of dwelling they can get into. If they can get into something that is going to protect them from the elements, kind of help them hide, they will get up in there. And a lot of people have started putting bat boxes in their yards to try to help the populations around here, help them find areas to safely roost. These organisms are adapted to several different types of diets. Those that are found in Texas are mostly insectivores, so they're going to eat mainly flying insects. We do have 2 species that consume nectar, and we have a record of 1 that consumes blood, so it's a fluid feeder. It is the hairy-legged vampire bat, but there's 1 record, and we haven't had any since then. So it's we're not really even sure if that was just a rogue individual or you know, maybe they do occur here, but their numbers are very, very low. When we look at their ecological role, the major thing is pest control. So they have saved farmers a significant amount of money in pesticides because they eat so many insects when they go out and eat at night. And I'll talk about those numbers here in a second. Those that consume nectar are important pollinators, so they're going to facilitate plant reproduction. And looking at our bat that we have here, a couple of the characteristics that you need to be aware of whenever you're using a field guide include the tragus. The tragus is a piece of skin that's found just inside of the ear. It may discuss a nose leaf, which is a little extension coming off the top of the nose. It can vary in size. And then it will talk about the patagium, and there are different parts. The tail membrane is the uropatagium. And then the wing membrane, they typically refer to as the chiropatagium. And so most times it's going to refer to this patagium that encases the tail. Looking at how much of the tail is encased can help you identify that are different species sometimes. So those are the characteristics that you typically want to be most familiar with. Looking at those that are most common in the High Plains area, we have the big free-tailed bat and the Brazilian free-tailed bat. And they're named free-tailed bats because the tail extends out of the uropatagium. And so it's only partially encased. And Brazilian free-tailed bats are probably the most abundant in Texas. Their biggest maternal colony is in the Bracken Cave system outside of San Antonio. And it's estimated that 100,000 free-tailed bats can consume 1,000 pounds of insects in a single night. So they can consume enough insects that it significantly outweighs their body weight. And so these have been extremely beneficial in helping to keep those pest numbers down in Texas. The hoary bat is going to have a mixture of silver and black and then a red face. These guys have a very bad attitude. When you catch them, they will let you hear all about it. They will hiss, they will open their mouth, and they will click at you, show their teeth. So they're definitely feisty. The pallid bat is easy to identify because of its coloration. It's a very light colored bat. Its fur is kind of a yellow tan, and then it's got very long ears. And all of these organisms, you can see here, it's eating a scorpion. They will use echolocation to locate the insects that they're going to consume. And so for the pallid bat, having these large ears is probably going to help it triangulate and really focus on where that organism is so that they have a better success rate at catching their prey. Townsend's big-eared bat is another that's easy to identify because of its large ear size. It's much darker in coloration than the pallid bat, and its ears are much larger. And then the big brown bat is going to be chestnut brown in coloration. It has black membranes on the wings, a black face, and black ears. And you can see here, looking at their teeth are sharp. They're specialized for penetrating and crushing that hard exoskeleton that we see covering insects. The last two that are easy to identify are the silver-haired bat. It's got this nice silver coloration on its back, and then the eastern red bat. It is red all over its body, and the hair comes all the way down on the tail membrane. These guys like to roost in trees. Typically, they roost exposed on branches. And this is a great picture because you can see typically bats only have one offspring every year. This one has had twins, so she has two that she's carrying. When they give birth upside down, and they catch their offspring in their wings, and then they'll attach to a nipple in the chest region. And she will carry them from that day on. And so you can see here, I mean, both of them are already almost the same size as she is. And so, I mean, it's probably difficult to carry one, much less two, but they do. They carry them when they go hunt. They carry them as they're roosting. And so they're attached until they're able to start venturing out on their own, learning how to fly, learning how to hang upside down when they roost. The last four, honestly, they're little brown bats. So when we start looking at anything that has myotis in the name, anything that has peristrel or paramyotis in the name, they are little brown bats. And so some of them are kind of easy to tell apart based on maybe ear size or coloration. Like this guy here, the American paramyotis, it's the only one that has a light membrane here at the forewing. But there are a lot of little brown bats in Texas, and they're really hard to tell apart unless you've got a field guide right there with you and you can take measurements. And even then, sometimes it's almost impossible to tell them apart until you get them back to the lab. The order Carnivora, this is typically the group that people are most familiar with because they think that they're cute and they're fluffy, and people are fascinated with the big cats and the big dogs. You know, major behavior for the carnivores is their predatory behavior. They've got a drive to stalk their prey. They have, you know, different techniques for subduing their prey. And they have adaptations to their body that help facilitate that. For instance, bears have a phenomenal sense of smell. Their ecological role is to help control population growth of prey species. So most of them will consume herbivores. And in doing so, they're keeping those herbivore populations from getting too large, which is going to prevent overgrazing. And so that's definitely going to help to maintain balance in the environments that they're living in. When we look at common carnivores of the high plains, many of these you're already familiar with. So we've got coyotes, the gray fox. This is a swift fox. These are smaller than the gray fox. When you look at the gray coloration, they're lighter. The tail is shorter and it's got a lot more hair on it. It's like a little poof. So it's definitely a bushy tail, and they are beautiful, beautiful foxes. The red fox is introduced. It is common in this area. It was introduced in around 1859 for sport. And so people wanted to hunt them, and they've kind of taken over. Bobcats, known for their characteristic bobtail. And most of the big cats that we have in Texas, if you look at the back of the ear, they'll also have a big white spot on the back of the ear. And then we have our mountain lion, or, well, mountain lion is the largest one that we have in significant numbers in Texas right now. We do have records of jaguars and jaguarundis, ocelots, which are a lot smaller. Every once in a while, we still get a sighting in South Texas, but for the most part, we don't see very many in Texas. We have 4 different species of skunks that occur in this area. The first one is the hognose skunk. These guys are going to have one solid white line that goes down the back all the way to the tip of the tail. And the width of that line can vary. So it can be very wide, like we see here, coming down to the sides, kind of a medium width or very narrow. This guy is more common. This is the striped skunk. They have a stripe between their eyes, and then they have a stripe on the back that makes a Y and goes down the sides. And again, width can vary. And finally, we have spotted skunks. There are 2 different species. This is the eastern spotted skunk. There's also a western spotted skunk. These, their range does include this area, but they're really, really rare in this area. They're much smaller bodied than the other 2 species we talked about. If you know skunks well, you can tell them apart. But they are, in my opinion, definitely the cutest. They like to do handstands as a defensive maneuver whenever they spray. So they will quite literally just stand on their front limbs and spray you as a defense mechanism. The long-tailed weasel is also a common carnivore in this area. A little bit harder to see. They're definitely going to avoid areas where there's a lot of human activity. But these guys also look like they're kind of wearing a mask similar to our raccoon, and their pelage is typically lighter during the winter. The American badger, he's a ferocious guy. His body is short and stocky, nice and wide. He's got these large claws that are great for digging. These guys like to live in prairie dog colonies, especially the larger ones. I mean, if you think about it, they've got a perfect supply of food, highly abundant right there. But you can definitely tell a badger burrow from the prairie dog burrows. They are quite large. You'll see the opening that's quite large. But they have smaller ears, which allows them to dig down into their burrows, and it prevents a lot of dirt from getting into their ears. The ring-tailed cat typically is going to be found in rocky areas. They like to live within rocky outcroppings. They've got a long, slender cat-like body. They're not a true cat. They're more closely related to the raccoon. And we're all familiar with raccoons. Next, we have our hoofed mammals. These are going to be called our even-toed ungulates. So this means that when they walk, the hoof makes 2 separate toes. And within this group, we have the bison, we have bighorn sheep, elk, and pronghorn that have all previously been extirpated in Texas, but there are efforts to try to reestablish all of these organisms back into Texas and try to replace those wild populations that we have lost. One of the most significant behaviors that we see in this group is a form of sexual selection. Males will quite literally battle for access to females. And they also do this to try to establish their mating territory. But when we look at the males in all of these groups, they have adaptations to their skulls that help to help with that impact whenever they run toward each other, and they have that impact where their heads crash together, and they have horns or antlers. And so these are going to be structures that are going to help them fight other males until one gives up, one gets injured, or sometimes the other one dies. And so for our bighorn sheep and the bison here, these are true horns. They have live bone inside of them, and they will continuously grow throughout the organism's lifespan. And that happens for all mammals with true horns except for the pronghorn. Pronghorns, they get to a certain size and then they stop growing. And then of course, things like deer and elk have antlers. Antlers are shed and regrown every year. And as they grow, they're covered with fur. They've got a lot of blood supply. Males will not fight during that time. They will not rut because it could cause damage and they could lose a significant amount of blood. But eventually, once they're fully grown, the skin will die, it will fall off, and then all you've got is dead bone on the head until it's shed. And those typically increase in size every year as that individual gets older. These are both grazers and browsers. So grazers we've talked about, we haven't talked about browsers. Deer are good examples of browsers. They're going to be a little bit different because they're not going to eat just the green leafy portion of a plant. They can also consume the woody portions of plants. So they can eat twigs, they can eat bark. And so again, this is going to prevent overgrowth of different plant types and try to, and it should, help with maintaining diversity in that ecosystem. Most common hoofed animals that we have in this area are going to be the mule deer and the white-tailed deer. You can tell the difference between them looking at ear size, looking at how the antlers branch, and then pronghorn are being reestablished throughout Texas. And there's a group on the Covered S Ranch as you're going between Post and Snyder that you'll see periodically out there. And that's probably the closest population that we have to Lubbock other than those that are found in Oklahoma. Within this group, we have several invasive species. So feral hogs, axis deer, black buck have all been introduced, and their population sizes are growing. They've probably been introduced because of people bringing them in for exotic hunts. And so they've escaped their enclosures, and a lot of the wildlife management areas will have draws for people to come in, and they can shoot any exotic that they find because they are really good at outcompeting the native deer and other organisms for resources. And so it's causing a major issue with our native mammals. We do have some marine mammals in the Gulf of Mexico that are a little more common than the manatee. Whales and dolphins are fairly common. When we look at their behaviors, they have the breaching behavior where they come up to breathe with their lungs. And of course, they also breach perhaps during mating season and in response to other type of stimuli. And they're not always sure why the breaching occurs, but they have some guesses as to why, you know, they come out of the water and kind of do these little flips where they turn over and lay on their back. Many of these organisms are going to be migratory. And so they'll have different parts of the ocean where they go to mate, raise their young, and then during seasons when they're not mating, they're traveling and they're eating and just, you know, having a ball out in the open ocean. Their major ecological role is that they modify habitats to increase species richness. So what this means is that their presence increases the presence of other organisms. So things like our humpback whales, they're going to consume plankton. So some of the largest mammals in the world consume the smallest organisms in the world. And as they're straining that plankton, you know, they're eating large quantities of it, but when the whales produce waste, those waste products, things like nitrogen, are absolutely essential for those plankton to survive. So it's interesting that while they're consuming large amounts, they're also helping to, you know, stabilize those populations. They're helping them flourish. And then they also do something called the whale pump. So as whales move vertically in the water from, you know, as deep as they can go all the way up to the surface, they're helping to mix minerals and other substances in the water. And so this is helping to distribute those materials that are essential for other living organisms. And so whether they're moving vertically or horizontally, they're causing mixture in the water, and this is helping to support other organisms. We have 7 species of baleen whales that are common in the Gulf of Mexico. These include things that you're probably familiar with, like the blue whale and the humpback whale. 17 that are considered to be toothed whales. So when you look at their teeth are all peg-like. They all look exactly the same, and they're going to consume fish, and typically they hunt in larger pods and try to get larger schools of fish together, get them disoriented, and it's a lot easier for them to pick off those fish. So this includes the bottlenose dolphin that we're all familiar with, as well as sperm whales, killer whales, and various other types of dolphins that are common in Texas. And then there are 3 species of beaked whales. Our next order is the most diverse order found within the mammals. There's a lot of diversity within the rodents. This personally is my favorite group. This is what I did my dissertation on. In many environments, they are considered keystone species. And what this means is that their presence is absolutely essential for the survival of other organisms. If you remove them, then those ecosystems collapse. Those food webs collapse. Rodents are going to help with pollination. And so as they're moving from flower to flower and drinking nectar, they can transfer pollen from one flower to another. and they help with seed and spore dispersal. So dispersing seeds that, obviously will aid in plant growth, spores that help to aid in the growth of fungi. When we look at rodents on the high plains, normally I would not include beavers, but beavers have made their way to Lubbock. The first one was discovered in 2015. They found a deceased individual in McKenzie Park. And then we got a call earlier this year about another roadkill individual, and there may have been some others since then. So they're thinking that they followed some floodplains during, I guess, 2014 or 2015 when Texas got a significant amount of rain. And so they were able to follow that up here. That's their hypothesis. They're not 100% sure, but we have beavers in Lubbock now. Beavers are ecosystem engineers. So they can make huge modifications to the areas that they're living in. And so here you can see the bark has been stripped off of a tree. They've been chewing on it. They can eventually chew all the way through, use some of those smaller pieces of wood to build their dams. And those dams will actually influence the flow of water in the rivers or streams that they're going to be found in. And so they can cause, large pools to form where organisms get trapped. They can completely restrict flow. They can change the pattern of water flow in these bodies of water. And so they can definitely have some noticeable impacts on the ecosystem. The northern pygmy mouse is a tiny little gray mouse, about the same color on its back and on its belly. If it's tiny and it's gray in one color, it's probably going to be the pygmy mouse. Wood rats are common throughout all of Texas. The two that we have here are the white-toothed wood rat and the southern plains wood rat. These are large rats. They build middens, and we can see those here. They'll build them in clusters of prickly pear. They'll find fallen tree logs or just piles of debris, junk piles, and they will build their middens within those areas. And so they bring in bark and twigs and even trash. So they like things that are shiny. So shotgun shells, bottles, anything that they can find and pile it on top. And some of these can get pretty tall. Here you can see this one goes up to about thigh height on most of the people standing here. And when you uncover these things, they actually have burrow systems in the soil. And what's interesting is, you don't typically think of rodents as being clean, but these guys are super clean. So they have different chambers in their burrow system. They'll have a chamber where their nest is located, a chamber where they store food, and then they have a separate chamber that acts as a latrine. And that is the only place where they will get rid of their waste products. And so they're actually really clean compared to some other rodents. But these are a lot of fun to catch. What we would do is you'd go through with rakes and hose, and you would clear off the debris on top, and you have people surrounding them. Everybody's wearing gloves, and they're down low, and they're waiting for the wood rat to run out. And so, when they run out, the chase is on. It's like a wood rat rodeo, and it's so much fun. Sometimes though, they don't come running out. You have to start digging, and you have to find them in their burrow system, which can be quite extensive. But within these middens, you typically don't see more than one adult. They're typically pretty solitary. Occasionally, you will find females that have a couple generations of their offspring in there. But this has probably been one of my favorite things to do, is to go and catch wood rats. And it's always a shock when something other than a wood rat runs out of the midden. We've had snakes, we've had skunks, shrews, lizards, all kinds of things run out at us. And so, skunk runs out, you start to lunge because you see something move, and then you see everybody back off really fast. So it's pretty entertaining. The hispid cotton rat is very common in the fields around this area. Hispid means that it has hairs that are bristle-like, so that are more stiff, and you can see them kind of sticking up off the back of the organism, but they kind of have this yellow-orange coloration to them. They kind of look like they have highlights, like everybody in the 90s got the frosted tips. That's what they look like. And they're nice, fat little mice. The northern grasshopper mouse is the only truly carnivorous mouse in this area. They have a very short tail, so it's much shorter than their body length. That's how you identify them. And they'll eat scorpions. They are actually immune to the scorpion stings, to the venom that's found in the scorpions. They'll eat spiders, so they'll target tarantulas that are the same size as they are. And what's interesting is they actually howl. So if I can get this to show up. So it's a very high-pitched howl, but they do that to mark their territory. And if you ever have two, you have a male and a female, and you put them in containers across the room from each other, they'll spend all night talking back and forth. But they howl to establish their territories. They howl to find a mate. And it's one of the most vocal rodents. It is the only vocal rodent like that in Texas. Deer mice in general, these are some of the hardest mice to tell apart. They're going to be gray or brown on their back, light gray to white underneath. They have long tails. Some of them are clearly bicolored, darker on top, lighter on bottom. Some of them not as much. These, you definitely have to have a field guide to tell them apart a lot of times. Some of them are easy based on ear size and overall body size. But conversations that I had with my advisor on field trips included things like, well, you know, how much white does it have on its ankle? And I'm like, well, I don't know. He said, well, is it below the ankle or above the ankle? And I'm like, it's above the ankle. How far above the ankle? I don't know. It looks like it's wearing crew socks. I don't know. So it's one of those things where you just have to have all of these organisms right next to each other really to tell them apart. And some of them we can't even identify in the field. Some of them we have to bring back with us, and we have to use DNA to identify them. So we're just going to collectively look at the deer mice here. These are significant because in a lot of areas, they do carry hantavirus, and hantavirus can be transferred to humans. Harvest mice are going to be small mice that are kind of an orangey brown on their back, gray underneath. They eat seeds and grass, and you can see the size comparison to an average human hand here. They are quite small. Black-tailed prairie dog, we're all familiar with. Got lots of them in this area. Their population numbers have significantly decreased as, you know, people have moved into this area, but they're still thriving even in urban areas. Their population numbers are typically controlled by the outbreak of plague, the Black Plague. And so every once in a while, population numbers will get really high in an area. There's an outbreak of plague. All of them die off. And after a couple of years, typically the population will recover as new individuals migrate in. The North American porcupine is the only mammal in Texas that has hairs modified into quills. And so it's definitely going to be a mechanical defense mechanism that they possess that's beneficial. They can climb trees, they eat bark, and so they would be considered browsers because they'll eat both green vegetation and eat woody parts of plants. Pocket gophers are going to spend almost all of their time underground. The only time they come up to the surface is to disperse and sometimes to mate. And so there are a couple different types that are found in this area. The yellow-faced pocket gopher is the largest, and you can typically tell it by its size, but it also, when you look at the teeth, it has a single groove in each incisor that's very deep. The other two are going to be very similar in size. If you look at them, their teeth have two grooves in the incisors, but they've got these large claws that help them dig and, you know, to make their burrows that can be pretty extensive and can span a large area. They've got reduced eyes, reduced ears, because they spend most of their time underground eating roots as they burrow around. But these organisms also, they're called pocket gophers because they have cheek pouches. And these guys don't really store anything in those cheek pouches, so I'm not really sure why they have them. But if you look at them and pull them apart, they've got a skin pouch that's covered in hair on either side. These guys too, if you ever catch one, never ever hold it by the nape of the neck. Their skin is loosely set on their muscle underneath. They can actually turn around and bite you. So you always handle a gopher by the tail. So just a little bit of information in case you ever come face to face with a gopher. Kangaroo rats are my personal favorite. They're really interesting because they live in dry habitats, so desert-like regions, and they don't drink water. They get all the water that they need from the seeds that they eat. So their kidneys are so efficient at pulling that water from the urine and returning it to the body that they don't have to drink water, and they will freak out if you give them water. They're called kangaroo rats because they hop on their hind legs that are longer than their front legs. They have long tails for balance, and they also have cheek pouches. So at night, they'll go out and they'll collect seeds, stuff them in the little cheek pouches, run back and put it in their little stash and go back out. These guys have triangular heads. You can kind of see it here. But another interesting thing about these organisms is that at the back of the skull, they have these inflated regions that help with hearing. They're one of the few small mammals that can hear an owl approaching. Most organisms can't hear them until they're right on top of them. They have a very keen sense of hearing, and their reflexes are also very, very good. So they're very good at escaping predation. The way you tell the difference between these two, the orange kangaroo rat is the most common in this area. It's got kind of that orangey brown to it. The banner-tailed kangaroo has the very fancy tail. So it's dark, and then it has the white tuft at the end. We have 3 different types of ground squirrels in this area. Typically, they're going to be found in areas where the grass is pretty well maintained. They love golf courses. The Rio Grande ground squirrel is going to have dots on its back that are found in uniform rows. The spotted ground squirrel has spots that are just randomly dispersed on the back. And then the 13-line ground squirrel is going to have alternating solid and dotted lines on the back. And of course, there are 13. These will spend time in their burrows during the day, and at night, they'll come out occasionally to feed on the surface. The eastern fox squirrel is a common tree squirrel in this area. The gray squirrel was introduced. And then we have pocket mice in this area. Like some of the others, they have cheek pouches, and we can see those here. They are completely lined with fur, and we can see little seeds sticking out of it. So they do the same thing. They go out at night, they collect seeds, stuff them in their cheek pouches, and then go back to their burrows and hide that in their stash. Other important roles that mammals play, all of them are going to help with nutrient cycling. So as they eat organisms and they produce waste products, they return nutrients to the soil, which helps with plant growth, and it just helps with overall food webs in those areas. And then a lot of them are really good at seed dispersal, especially those that are going to eat, either a variety diet that consists of both animal and plant material or just plant material. The squirrels are very good at dispersing seeds. Since they store their seeds, they'll stash them and then they forget where they are. So you'll end up growing plants that you didn't plant in your pots or in your yard because they help disperse those seeds. Okay, moving on to last few things, talking about trapping, estimating population sizes, and then we will discuss threats to mammals. Most of the traps that we use and a lot of biologists use are live traps. And so we have things like mist nets that will help us to capture bats. These are going to be typically nets that have 4 sections in them, and you hang them up during the day. You open them at twilight so that as those bats are emerging, hopefully they'll get stuck in it. And you want to target them in areas that look like flyways or areas surrounding water. And when the bat hits it, it gets tangled in there. So you have to untangle it. And then, of course, it's alive. You can go ahead and take measurements. You can, take wing clips, so pieces of skin from the wing, to do studies. You can swab them to see if they're carrying any diseases. But this is typically the most efficient way to capture bats, other than going directly into where they roost and actually physically, pulling them down from those structures. Sherman traps are ideal for rodents. These are rectangular traps that are going to have a little lever on the inside. You can kind of see that here. And this is the door here. And we bait them with a mixture of rolled oats and seed. And if you're in an area where ants are not a problem, you can also add peanut butter and make little peanut butter balls for them, and they go crazy for that. But when they run in there, they step on that lever and it causes that door to snap shut. And so they've got some room to move around in there. They've got a nice snack, and they should be safe until the next morning. You can get them out and you can handle them. Great thing about these is that they fold flat. And so you can carry, typically around 50 of them with you at one time and set them. Have-a-heart traps are going to be similar in their concept, except that they're made out of the wire mesh. But you bait them, typically targeting carnivores. We have used them for wood rats as well. This is a smaller version of that, but the larger ones that we're targeting Larger carnivores or potentially possums will bait them with sardines. Sometimes they use cat food. So there's a variety of things that you can use to attract them. They walk in, step on that lever, and they have a door that snaps shut too. And there are safe ways to release them. We typically use herp sticks to grab onto it, and as you pull on it, it causes the door to collapse, the locking mechanism collapses, and then the organism can run out. So we've got some of our students releasing a possum here, and that little raccoon is here ready to be released next. For gophers and moles, most of the traps are kill traps. This is a Victor trap, also called Maccabee traps. And those are just the brands, but that's what they call them. When you dig up gopher mounds, what you're going to do is you're going to look for where you have two openings. And when you open up their burrows, they can sense a change in the atmosphere in those burrows. So they know that, it collapsed. So they'll go and they'll be attracted to that area. They'll want to go and plug it up. And when they walk through and they hit that lever, it causes these two little prongs to snap. And most times it's going to result in death of the organism. It's usually pretty quick, especially if it gets them in the lungs. Sometimes you get them by a foot. But they do have live traps now that you can buy. This is one that you can get off of Amazon. The ones we used were just PVC pipe that had a covering on one end, lever on the inside that would snap a door shut whenever they walked into it. Cameras are also common for recording data about mammals. We were able to discover that raccoons and feral hogs have formed a pretty interesting relationship. And there's a group at the Texas Tech campus in Waco that's studying this. But apparently the raccoons will climb up on the deer feeders. They'll trip them so that the boars get food. And then the boars protect them from other organisms that come in and try to eat from that area. And so they'll run off other boars and the raccoons will ride their backs. And so there are a lot of pictures on the internet now of raccoons just riding the backs of feral hogs. But we can get a lot of data from pictures like this. Like for instance, here we've got an American black bear and we can see that she has 3 cubs. So that helps us understand, how many they're having, help us keep track of how many might be in the area. When we mark mammals, sometimes you can use bands. So our little hoary bat here has a little metal band on his arm, and it has a number on it that's unique to that group that's doing the banding. You can take toe clips. This is typically pretty common in rodents. The combination of toes that are clipped off will help you identify the organism. GPS collars are going to be used for larger organisms like deer. There's a group from A&M that's doing a study out at Yoakum Dunes Wildlife Management Area that's not far from here. And they have GPS collars on a lot of the male mule deers out there. And they come by every once in a while and try to track them and see how far they're ranging or moving around that area. They've also equipped wolves with these, and you have other GPS systems that are a lot smaller that you can put on smaller organisms. Ear tags can be beneficial for larger mammals. They do not work well for the mice because their ears are very delicate and they tear easily. So if it gets caught, they lose their ear tags. And then if you're doing a marker capture and it's something short term, you can use fluorescent dyes, either a powder or a liquid that you just put on the organism's head or on their back. That way, when you put them under a black light, you can see if you've caught that individual before. So while we're talking about that, let's talk about estimating mammal population sizes. Some of the most common ways to do this are by direct observation, and this is a lot easier for the bigger organisms. You can take people out, you can count how many you see. Some of these are done from helicopters, and then there's the mark and recapture technique. And this is typically used for smaller organisms. This is a very simple example. They can get much more complicated than this, but for the most part, it can be simple math. So to estimate the total population size, you're taking the total number of individuals that you caught on the first day, multiplied by the total number of individuals you caught on the second day, and then you divide that by the number that you caught or recaptured. And so if we were to look at the example that we have here, on day 1, in this blue circle, we have 8 individuals. We would take 8 times the number that we catch on the second day, which is 8 again, and then we divide that by the number that we caught both days. And in that case, it's going to be 2. And so we take 64 divided by 2, and we could estimate that there's about 32 individuals in that area. And so the way they typically do this is when they go out and they want to estimate population sizes, they make a grid. And so it can be a square grid where they have people a specific distance apart, setting traps at certain distances, or it can be a circle where people start in the middle and they go out in different directions and they have to set their traps a certain distance apart. So you have a uniform grid that allows you to estimate those population sizes in that well-defined area. And finally, biggest threats to Texas mammals, biggest thing is poaching. People hunting outside of, declared hunting seasons, as well as poaching as far as, killing the large carnivores, bobcats, mountain lions, coyotes that they consider to be pests. Habitat destruction is a major issue, especially as our cities continue to grow. For our marine mammals, especially those that are a little bit smaller, boat collisions are typically detrimental for those organisms. And then some of them have very low reproductive yields. So we talked about bats. Bats only produce 1 offspring per year. And for the size of a bat, that is really, really low because most mammals that size have many offspring in 1 year. And so their reproductive cycles are very slow compared to other mammals, which could be an issue for bats in the future. Disease is also an area of concern. White nose syndrome, I believe, has made its way into Texas. I know definitely we had positive results in Oklahoma. I'm pretty sure we've had at least 1 positive in Texas. It's a fungus that essentially causes an itch on bats that are hibernating, and they wake up multiple times. They end up using all their energy reserves. They try to go out and feed. There's no insects available because it's the middle of winter, and they end up dying. Plague for the prairie dogs, and then of course rabies. Most mammals are susceptible to rabies, and it can be detrimental. And there are some that are typically going to carry rabies more often than others. Bats, raccoons, skunks, the carnivores are typically going to most often have rabies. Climate change is another issue. As our climate continues to change, some of these organisms may not be able to survive. Either because they're not well equipped to do so or because their food sources die off. And then finally, pesticides and poisons. As we put poisons out for things like rodents, if they consume them and they don't immediately die, you can have a fox or a coyote come up and eat that rodent. They then have ingested it. Pesticides can also be detrimental as organisms are exposed to those chemicals. And we do see a lot of different chemicals building up in the environment and building up in these organisms' bodies. And it could be detrimental. If it's not detrimental, then it can cause some significant health issues later on. So if you're interested in learning more about how to identify these animals, specific measurements, things like that, if you're interested in the history of these mammals in Texas, this is a really good book to read. It's very detailed, but for the most part, the language is very easy to understand. It's a big, thick book by David Schmidley and Robert Bradley, my advisor. They just released this new edition not too long ago. And so it's definitely a good read if this is something you want to learn more about. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them to the best of my ability.
Wow, so that was great, Megan. Yeah, that was really wonderful. We could tell you spent a lot of time on it, and thank you. It did answer all of our questions that we needed to answer in the book section. I see a hand raised there. Sue, is that you?
That was an accident.
Oh, okay. Anybody have questions?
I do. I'm wondering if you know how to tell the difference between a feral hog and a wild boar.
They're pretty much the same thing. The only one that we have in this area that is, or in Texas that is native, is a javelina, and it's a lot smaller and it has a collar, like a light collar around its neck. So everything else is your feral hog, wild boar type.
Okay.
Yeah. we don't want them here.
Yeah.
I guess with the new construction on the wall, there are going to be many fewer sightings of some of our wild cats coming across the border. Is that expected?
That is a huge area of concern for a lot of biologists, and there have been a lot of people that have really been vocal about that, because it is going to restrict movement of the big cats, but also bears and other organisms that have a tendency to move up into South Texas during different parts of the year. And so that would definitely impact the diversity in Texas, and it would reduce their ranges, which would not be beneficial.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Let's see, do you have questions? No, lots of comments. Fantastic presentation. I'm surprised at the diversity of mammals in our area and in Texas overall. That was great. I really enjoyed this presentation and really focused and articulate presentation. So
Thank you.
thank you.
Well, and if, I don't know if y'all have to do any of this, but if you're ever interested in learning how those traps work, if I was doing this in person, I plan to set some and bring traps in so y'all can see them, and we didn't get to do that. But we have several people at SPC that love to take people out. We do it with students, with different classes. So if that's something that anybody's ever interested in,
Oh,
you know, the next time we go out and we do one of those events with students, you're happy to tag along, or you're welcome to tag along. We'd be happy to have you. So
thank you. Thank you.
So I have a question.
Here we go.
In using the Sherman live traps, I know in some areas people are, because of the shrews and the problem with their metabolism, how do you make sure that you don't capture them and cause that problem? Or do you try to use a kill trap when you're looking at capturing them?
So for those, they will also eat the seeds. So as long as there's plenty in there, they should make it overnight. But if we get one and it's still alive, we try to feed it immediately to
Okay.
keep it alive. A lot of times you'll open it up and they'll be dead, but most times they're so light that they don't set those traps off.
Oh,
And
okay.
so you have to use, a lot of times they'll use pitfalls to catch the shrews. So they dig into the ground, put containers in there, throw insects in there, and shrews will run in there and get caught, but they still have food because of the insects.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much, Megan.
Well,
Dr.
I'm glad that I got to do this.
Sorry,
And
I'm referring to you, Megan. Sorry about that. Dr.
okay. That's fine. I don't get to talk about mammals very often. Normally it's like 15 minutes in class, then we have to move on to something else. So.
Oh gosh, we love mammals. And I wanted to tell you, I work at the Landmark. We have a beaver out there now.
Do you?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
I don't know if there's one or two. Do they usually come in pairs?
Males will probably be pretty solitary, but if they have mating pairs, sometimes they'll form and they'll live together.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very exciting for us because there have never been beavers on the Llano Estacado from an archaeological point of view.
Right.
So it's very, and they built a blind for me just so I could see the beaver. And
Oh, nice.
so, yeah, it's great. Anyway, if you ever come out, want to bring students out to the Landmark, we have animals to see.
I may have to come out there and check out the beavers.
Yeah, I'd love to show you.
Sounds good.
You can see them at about 30 minutes before sunrise.
Okay. Awesome.
All right, anybody else have questions or comments? All right, well, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Everybody have a good evening.
You too.
You too. That was excellent.
Yeah,
Yes.
Very
excellent.
good.
Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful.